Louisiana, November 1945. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell walked the rows at the women's compound at Camp Ruston, her medical kit heavy against her hip, checking each prisoner for signs of illness before the coming winter. The war had ended 6 months earlier, but thousands of German women still waited for repatriation, living in converted military barracks under American supervision. Sarah had examined dozens that morning tired women, malnourished women, women bearing the visible scars of war. But when she reached Barrack 7 and asked 23-year-old Anneliese Becker to undress for the routine physical examination, Sarah's hands froze. The woman's body told a story she hadn't spoken aloud. Fresh stretch marks crossed her abdomen like silver rivers. Her breasts showed signs of recent lactation. And when Sarah pressed gently on her lower stomach, Anneliese's sharp intake of breath confirmed what the nurse already suspected. This woman had given birth. Recently, very recently. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The examination room was cold, the November wind seeping through gaps in the wooden walls. Anneliese stood before her in a thin regulation shift, trembling though, whether from cold or fear, Sarah couldn't determine. Around them, the camp hummed with its usual sounds. Guards making their rounds, women talking in the adjacent barracks, the distant clang of the mess hall preparing lunch. "Anneliese," Sarah said carefully in her broken German, "when did you have your baby?" The young woman's eyes widened. For a long moment, she said nothing, her jaw clenched so tight Sarah could see the muscles working beneath her skin. Then, in halting English learned during her months of captivity, Anneliese whispered, 6 days ago. In the night, alone, the words hung in the cold air like smoke. 6 days. Sarah's medical training immediately catalogued the dangers: infection, hemorrhage, retained tissue, postpartum complications that could prove fatal without proper care. And the baby? Where was the baby? Where is the child now? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the alarm coursing through her veins. Anneliese's composure cracked. Tears carved lines down her hollow cheeks, and her hands moved protectively to her abdomen, as though the child still rested there. Hidden. Safe. Please, you must not tell the authorities. They will take her from me. Send me back to Germany without her. I cannot lose another child. Another child. The words revealed layers of tragedy Sarah could only begin to imagine. She gestured for Anneliese to sit on the examination table, then pulled up a wooden stool, positioning herself at eye level with the frightened woman. I need to examine you properly, Sarah said. Make sure you're healing correctly. And I need to see the baby. But first, tell me everything. From the beginning. Anneliese's story emerged slowly, in fragments punctuated by long silences and tears. She'd been working in a munitions factory near Hamburg when the factory was captured by British forces in April 1945. The workers, mostly women, were detained, then transferred to American custody, then shipped across the Atlantic to prisoner camps in the United States. By then, Anneliese was 5 months pregnant. My husband was lost in the East, she explained, her English improving as she relaxed slightly. Our first child, a son, was 2 years old. He died in the bombing of Hamburg, the firestorm. I was at the factory. When I returned, there was nothing. No building, no street, no body to bury. Just ash. Sarah felt the familiar weight of such stories. Every prisoner she'd examined carried similar losses, similar grief. The war had consumed millions, left countless others hollow and haunted. When I learned I was pregnant again, Anneliese continued, I thought perhaps God was giving me another chance, a new life to replace the one I'd lost. But then we were captured, transferred, sent here, and I was terrified. What would happen to a baby born in a prisoner camp? Would they take her from me? Put her in an institution? Send her away? So you hid the pregnancy, Sarah said, understanding dawning. I wore loose clothing, bound my stomach when it began to show. The other women knew, some of them, but they said nothing. We protect each other here. It is all we have left. Annelise's hands trembled as she spoke. When the labor started, 6 nights ago, I told no one. I went to the bathroom after lights out. The baby came quickly, too quickly. I barely made any sound. Sarah tried to imagine it giving birth alone in a camp latrine, biting back screams, catching your own child in the darkness, cutting the cord with... What? She was afraid to ask. I used a blade from my sewing kit, Annalise said, as though reading Sarah's thoughts. Sterilized it with alcohol I'd saved from the medical supplies. The cord was thick. It took several cuts, but I managed. And the bleeding stopped eventually. The matter-of-fact recitation of these impossible acts stunned Sarah. The courage or desperation required to deliver your own child in such conditions, to care for a newborn in secret while maintaining the appearance of normalcy during daily roll calls and work assignments, it defied comprehension. Where did you hide her during the day? Sarah asked. In a box beneath my bunk, lined with blankets. The other women in my barracks help. They take turns watching her, feeding her with cloth dipped in water and milk we save from breakfast. At night, I hold her against my chest beneath my blanket. She is so small, so quiet, she rarely cries. It is as though she knows she must be silent to survive. Sarah's medical training warred with her human sympathy. The child needed proper examination, proper nutrition, proper care. But Annelise's fears weren't unfounded. The regulations regarding prisoners and their dependents are complex and often harsh. Officially, a baby born in a prisoner camp would be registered, documented, and potentially separated from its mother during repatriation processing. I need to see her, Sarah said firmly. I understand your fear, Annalise, but the baby needs medical attention, and you do too. You've been incredibly fortunate that infection hasn't set in, but that could change quickly. Annelise's eyes filled with fresh tears. You will report us. I will examine you both. Then we'll discuss what comes next. Sarah stood, offering her hand. Trust me, please. The walk back to Barracks 7 felt endless. Sarah kept her expression neutral, nodding to the guards they passed, maintaining the appearance of routine medical rounds. Inside, her mind churned through options and consequences, regulations, and human needs. The barracks was empty when they entered. Most prisoners were at their assigned work details. Annalise led Sarah to a bunk in the far corner, dropped to her knees, and pulled out a wooden crate that had once held canned goods. Inside, wrapped in layers of blankets, lay the smallest, most fragile infant Sarah had ever seen. The baby was tiny, perhaps 5 pounds, Sarah estimated, with a shock of dark hair and translucent skin that showed every vein beneath. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. She wore a makeshift diaper fashioned from torn cloth and a gown that appeared to have been sewn from an old pillowcase. Sarah knelt beside the crate, her professional instincts taking over. She listened to the baby's heart rapid but strong, checked her color pale but not cyanotic, examined her cord stump surprisingly clean, healing well. The child was severely underweight, likely premature or growth restricted from malnutrition during pregnancy, but against all odds, she appeared to be surviving. What did you name her? Sarah asked softly. Marguerite, after my mother. Annelise's voice broke. She died in the war also. Everyone is gone. Marguerite is all I have left of my family, of my life before. Sarah completed her examination of the baby, then conducted a thorough assessment of Annalise. A young mother showed signs of severe anemia and malnutrition, but her uterus was contracting normally, and there were no signs of infection. The birth had been as clean as possible given the circumstances, a minor miracle. You need iron supplements, Sarah said, and more food. You're nursing her? When I can. The milk is not much, not enough. She is always hungry. I'll arrange for additional rations. Officially, they'll be for your recovery from illness. No one needs to know the real reason. Sarah paused, considering her next words carefully. But Annalise, we need to register Marguerite. We need to make her existence official. Annelise's voice rose and dropped to a fierce whisper. They will take her, send us to different places. I cannot bear it. Listen to me. Sarah gripped the young woman's shoulders gently. If we don't register her, if she remains hidden, what happens when you're repatriated? You can't smuggle a baby onto a transport ship. Someone will discover her eventually, and then the situation becomes much more complicated. But if we establish her identity now, if we document that she was born here and needs to remain with her mother, we have a chance of keeping you together. No. The logic was sound, but Sarah knew she was making promises she might not be able to keep. The military bureaucracy was vast and often in different individual circumstances. But hiding the child indefinitely was impossible, and discovery through accident or betrayal would be far worse than controlled disclosure. I need to speak with my commanding officer, Sarah continued. Captain Morrison is a reasonable man. He has children of his own. If I explain the situation, if I emphasize the medical necessity of keeping mother and child together, he might support us. And if he does not, then we find another way. But Annalise, you've been incredibly brave, and you've done everything possible to protect Marguerite. Now let someone help you. Let me help you. The young woman's resistance wavered. She looked at her daughter, still sleeping peacefully in the makeshift crib, and Sarah saw the calculation happening, weighing the risks of continued secrecy against the dangers of disclosure, trying to determine which path offered the best chance of survival for her child. What do you need me to do? Annalise asked finally. Stay here. Care for Marguerite. I'll return within 2 hours. If Captain Morrison agrees to help, we'll need to move quickly to document everything properly. Sarah left the barracks with her medical kit and a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. The situation was unprecedented in her experience. She'd treated wounded prisoners, delivered babies in difficult circumstances, managed medical crises with limited resources. But a woman who'd given birth alone and hidden her newborn for nearly a week? That was beyond anything in the military medical manual. Captain James Morrison's office was in the camp's administrative building, a sturdy structure that had once housed a lumber company. Sarah found him reviewing paperwork, his desk covered with transport manifests and repatriation schedules. He looked up when she entered, registering the tension in her expression. Nurse Mitchell, what can I do for you? Sarah closed the door behind her and took a breath. Sir, I need to report an unusual situation, and I need your help managing it discreetly. She explained everything, the examination, the hidden birth, the infant surviving against impossible odds, Annelise's fears and desperate measures. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. Good Lord, he said when she finished. 6 days. She delivered alone 6 days ago, and told no one? Yes, sir. She's terrified of being separated from the child. And honestly, sir, given the usual protocols, her fears aren't unjustified. Morrison leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This is going to create a bureaucratic nightmare. An undocumented birth, unreported for nearly a week, in a facility under my command. The Red Cross will have questions. The State Department will have questions. Hell, everyone will have questions. With respect, sir, the bureaucratic complications are secondary to the medical and humanitarian considerations. That baby needs proper nutrition and care. The mother needs postnatal treatment. And both need stability, the assurance that they won't be forcibly separated. You're asking me to bend regulations that exist for good reasons, nurse. I'm asking you to prioritize the welfare of a newborn infant and her mother over administrative convenience. Sarah kept her voice steady but firm. Sir, I've been working in this camp for 8 months. I've seen how we treat these women with basic decency, with recognition of their humanity, despite their status as prisoners. This situation calls for the same approach. We have an opportunity to do the right thing." Morrison was silent for a long moment, staring at the papers on his desk. Sarah recognized the weight of command in his expression, the knowledge that every decision had consequences, that compassion and regulation often conflicted, that the easy path was rarely the right one. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. "We document the birth retroactively. List the complications that prevented immediate reporting medical emergency, confusion, language barriers. We register Marguerite as a dependent of a prisoner, note the medical necessity of keeping her with her mother, and make it part of the official record that separation would constitute a health risk for both. That's not strictly true. Other mothers and infants have been separated. Other mothers didn't deliver alone in a latrine and then care for their newborns in secret for a week. The psychological trauma Annalise has experienced losing her husband, her first child, her home, giving birth in captivity, that's documented medical fact. Adding the trauma of forced separation from her only surviving child could have severe consequences. I can write a medical recommendation to that effect." Morrison studied her face, seeming to weigh her sincerity and expertise. "You'd stake your medical credentials on that assessment?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely." "And if higher authorities question our handling of this situation?" "Then I'll take full responsibility. I'll state that I discovered the situation, made an immediate medical judgment, and acted accordingly. You supported your medical officer's recommendations." "That's proper chain of command." Another long silence. Outside, the camp continued its daily routine, guards changing shifts, prisoners moving between work assignments, the ordinary machinery of military detention grinding forward. Inside this office, two people tried to find space for compassion within a system designed for order and control. "All right," Morrison said. "Here's what we'll do. You'll examine both mother and child again, this time officially. Document everything, the birth, the current health status, your medical recommendations. I'll have the camp chaplain present as a witness. We'll complete all necessary paperwork and submit it through proper channels, noting the unusual circumstances, but emphasizing that the situation is now under control and being managed appropriately. And keeping them together? I'll make the recommendation that separation would constitute a medical risk. I'll note that the mother's psychological state requires continuity of care with her infant. Beyond that, I can't guarantee what higher authorities will decide, but we'll have done our part to advocate for the most humane solution." Relief flooded through Sarah. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. This could still blow up in all our faces. But you're right. We have an obligation to do what's best for that child, and sometimes that means bending the system rather than breaking people to fit it." The next 2 hours were a blur of activity. Sarah returned to Barracks 7 with Captain Morrison and Chaplain Williams, a kind-faced man who'd been a parish priest before the war. They found Annalise where Sarah had left her, sitting on the bunk with Marguerite cradled against her chest. The young mother's terror was palpable when 2 military officers entered her barracks, but Sarah quickly moved to reassure her. "It's all right. Captain Morrison is here to help. We're going to make everything official. Make sure you and Marguerite are protected." The examination was thorough and documented with meticulous care. Sarah narrated every finding while Chaplain Williams took notes. The baby's weight, 4 pounds, 13 ounces. Her length, 17 inches. Her general condition, undernourished but stable. The appearance of the umbilical cord stump, the mother's postpartum state. Captain Morrison asked questions that would establish the timeline and circumstances, his tone professional but not unkind. "When did you first realize you were in labor?" "Around midnight, 6 days ago. The pains were strong, coming close together." "And you went to the bathroom facility alone?" "Yes. I could not risk waking the others. I did not know how long it would take." "How long was the delivery?" "Perhaps 2 hours. Maybe less. A baby came quickly once the pushing began." The questions continued, building a record that would justify the delayed reporting while emphasizing the extraordinary circumstances. Through it all, Marguerite slept in her mother's arms, occasionally making small sounds, but never crying, as though she understood that silence remained essential to her survival. When the examination concluded, Captain Morrison spoke directly to Annalise. "Mrs. Becker, I want you to understand what happens next. We're going to register your daughter officially. That means paperwork, documentation, permanent records. It also means that certain people in the military bureaucracy will become aware of her existence and may have questions about how this situation was managed." Annalise clutched Marguerite tighter. "And will you separate us?" "I'm going to recommend against separation on medical grounds. Nurse Mitchell will provide supporting documentation. But I can't guarantee what decisions will be made above my level of authority. What I can guarantee is that we'll advocate for keeping you together, and we'll provide proper medical care for both of you." "That is more than I hoped for." Annelise's voice was barely audible. "Thank you." The paperwork took most of the afternoon. Sarah drafted her medical assessment, emphasizing the unique psychological factors and the medical risks of separation. Captain Morrison wrote his command recommendation, noting the unusual circumstances, but praising the prisoner's resilience and the humane considerations involved. Chaplain Williams added his own statement about the moral imperative of preserving the mother-child bond. By evening, the documents were complete and ready for submission through military channels. Sarah returned to the women's compound with supplies iron supplements for Annalise, powdered milk formula for Marguerite, clean cloth for diapers, a proper cradle that she'd requisitioned from camp stores. She also brought news that Annalise's food rations would be doubled, officially for medical recovery, but actually to support nursing. The other women in Barrack 7 gathered around as Sarah set up the cradle beside Annalise's bunk. They'd known about the baby, had helped hide and protect her, and now watched with obvious relief as the secret became official. "You should all know," Sarah told them in her halting German, "that your friend showed remarkable courage. What she did delivering alone, caring for her child in such difficult circumstances, that required strength most people never have to find. You should be proud of her, and proud of yourselves for helping." One of the older women, Maria, stepped forward. "Will they punish us for knowing and not reporting?" "No. Captain Morrison understands that you are helping a fellow prisoner in need. That's not a punishable offense. It's human decency." The women relaxed visibly. Several reached out to touch Marguerite gently, murmuring words of blessing in German. Sarah watched these small acts of tenderness and felt something shift in her own understanding of what she was witnessing. These weren't just prisoners. They were mothers and daughters, sisters and friends, women who'd been swept up in a war they didn't start and were now trying to preserve whatever scraps of humanity remained. Over the following weeks, Sarah monitored Annalise and Marguerite closely. The baby gained weight slowly but steadily, responding well to the supplemental formula and her mother's improving milk supply. Annalise's anemia improved with the iron supplements and increased rations. And gradually, the young mother's fear began to ease, replaced by cautious hope that she might actually be allowed to keep her daughter. The response from higher military authorities came 6 weeks after the initial report. Sarah was called to Captain Morrison's office to review the decision. She found him reading the official correspondence, his expression carefully neutral. "What did they say?" she asked, unable to keep the anxiety from her voice. Morrison handed her the letter. "Read it yourself." Sarah scanned the military jargon and bureaucratic language, looking for the key passage. And there it was buried in paragraph 4. In light of the medical recommendations provided and the extraordinary circumstances documented, authorization is granted to maintain prisoner Annalise Becker and dependent minor Marguerite Becker as a family unit through the duration of detention and subsequent repatriation processing. They approved it, Sarah breathed. They're letting them stay together. With conditions, Morrison added. Regular medical monitoring, behavioral assessments, periodic reviews. But yes, Essentially, they've agreed that separating them would cause more problems than it would solve. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Thank you, sir, for supporting this, for pushing it through channels. Thank you for bringing it to my attention the right way, for giving us the chance to handle it properly. Morrison leaned back in his chair. You know, I've been doing this job for nearly 2 years now, managing prisoners, processing paperwork, following regulations. It's easy to forget that we're dealing with human beings, not just case files and transport manifests. This situation reminded me why we're supposed to be better than the regime we fought against. Why the details matter. The news spread through the women's compound quickly. When Sarah arrived to conduct her routine medical check, she found Annalise sitting in the winter sunshine outside the barracks, Marguerite bundled in blankets against her chest. The young mother's face was transformed, still thin, still bearing the marks of hardship, but lit with something that might have been joy. They will let us stay together? Annalise asked as Sarah approached. Yes, through repatriation and return to Germany. Wherever you're sent, Marguerite goes with you. Annalise closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. I prayed for this, every night, every moment. I prayed that God would not take another child from me. Sarah sat beside her on the bench, watching the baby sleep peacefully. Tell me about your plans for when you return to Germany. I have a sister in Berlin, if she survived. If I can find her, otherwise, Annalise shrugged. I will find work, find a place to live. I was a teacher before the war. Perhaps I can teach again. Or work in a factory. Anything. It does not matter as long as Marguerite is with me. She needs regular medical care. Make sure you find a doctor as soon as you're settled. I will. I promise. Annalise adjusted the blanket around her daughter's face. Nurse Mitchell, I want you to know that I will tell Marguerite about you. When she is older, when she can understand, I will tell her about the American nurse who saved our lives. You saved your own lives, Sarah corrected gently. I just helped make it official. But even as she said it, Sarah knew it wasn't entirely true. The system would have separated them without her intervention, without Captain Morrison's support, without the careful documentation that made bureaucrats see human beings rather than just problems to be solved. Sometimes survival required more than individual courage. It required institutions and individuals willing to bend, to find space for compassion within the rigid structures of military order. The repatriation came in March 1946. By then, Marguerite was 4 months old, a healthier baby than she'd been at birth, but still small, still fragile. Annalise had regained some weight, though she would never be robust. The war had taken too much from her body and soul. Sarah accompanied them to the transport staging area, carrying Marguerite's medical records and a letter of introduction to Red Cross workers in Germany who could help Annalise find her sister and establish herself. The farewell was brief. Too many prisoners were being processed for extended goodbyes, but meaningful. Be safe, Sarah said, embracing Annalise carefully, mindful of the baby between them. Take care of each other. We will. Annalise's English had improved dramatically during her months of captivity. And Nurse Mitchell? Thank you for seeing us. For seeing past the uniforms and the camps and the war. For remembering that we are human. Sarah watched them board the truck that would take them to the port, watched until the vehicle disappeared into the distance. Around her, other prisoners were saying their own goodbyes. Guards were completing paperwork. The machinery of demobilization ground forward. But Sarah's mind was on that small family, on the impossible journey that lay ahead of them, on the hope that somehow, against all odds, they would survive, and perhaps even thrive. She never saw Annalise or Marguerite again. The chaos of post-war Europe made tracking individual refugees nearly impossible. But 2 years later, Sarah received a letter forwarded through Red Cross channels. It was written in careful English on thin paper, dated July 1948. Dear Nurse Mitchell, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted you to know that Marguerite and I are alive and safe. We found my sister in Berlin. She had survived, though barely. We are living with her and her children in a small apartment. The city is still ruins, but it is rebuilding, and so are we. Marguerite is 2 years old now. She is small for her age, but healthy, curious about everything, full of life. She does not remember the camp, does not remember those first terrible days. For her, life began when we came to Berlin, and I am grateful for that mercy. I am teaching again at a school for children who lost their families in the war. There are so many orphans, so much need. But teaching gives me purpose, reminds me that the future exists, that the children growing up now will not repeat our mistakes. I have told Marguerite about you, though she is too young to understand. But I will keep telling her, and one day she will know that a woman she never met loved her enough to fight for her, to make sure she could stay with her mother when the rules said otherwise. I do not know if we will ever meet again in this life, but please know that you gave me back the will to live, the hope that kindness still exists in the world. That gift was more valuable than you can imagine. With deepest gratitude, Anneliese Becker. Sarah kept that letter in her desk drawer for the rest of her life. She returned to civilian practice after the war, worked in a hospital in Virginia, married a doctor she met there, raised 3 children. But she never forgot the German mother who gave birth alone in a prisoner camp, who hid her newborn for 6 days out of desperate love, who fought to survive so her daughter could live. The story became part of Sarah's family lore, told to her children and grandchildren as an illustration of how individual choices could matter, how small acts of courage, both Anneliese's and her own, could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Her daughter followed her into nursing, inspired by the story of the hidden baby and the nurse who helped protect her. Years later, in 1968, Sarah received another letter. This one was written in perfect English, the handwriting neat and professional. Dear Mrs. Mitchell, you do not know me, but you saved my life before I was old enough to know I needed saving. My name is Marguerite Becker Hoffmann. My mother, Anneliese, told me about you from my earliest memories, about the American nurse who made it possible for us to stay together when the rules said we should be separated. My mother passed away last year, peacefully, surrounded by family. Before she died, she made me promise to find you, to thank you personally for what you did. It took me months to track down your current address, but I am a teacher like my mother, and teachers are persistent. I wanted you to know what became of the baby you helped protect. I grew up in Berlin, attended university, became a teacher of English and history. I married a good man, a doctor, and we have 2 children of our own. My life has been ordinary in the best possible way. No drama, no tragedy, just the quiet accumulation of happy days. But none of that would have happened without you, without your willingness to see my mother as a person rather than a prisoner, to see me as a baby who needed protecting rather than a problem to be solved. You gave us the chance to be a family, and that chance became everything. My mother told me often that there were people in the war who chose cruelty and people who chose kindness, and that those choices defined who they truly were. She said you chose kindness when it would have been easier to follow rules blindly. That choice saved 2 lives and made possible the lives that came after my children, my students, everyone I've touched, because I was allowed to grow up. Thank you does not seem sufficient, but it is all I have to offer. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for fighting for us. Thank you for being the kind of person who makes the world better in small, essential ways. With profound gratitude, Dr. Marguerite Hoffmann. Sarah wept when she read that letter, overcome by the realization that the frightened baby she de-examined in a prisoner barracks had grown into a woman with children of her own, that the life she de-helped preserve had blossomed into exactly the kind of ordinary miracle the war had tried to destroy. She wrote back immediately, beginning a correspondence that would last until Sarah's death in 1983. The letters covered everything: Marguerite's teaching career, her children's accomplishments, the slow healing of post-war Germany, the persistent memories of wartime trauma, the ways history echoed through generations. And always, beneath the surface topics, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened in that Louisiana prisoner camp in 1945, when two women from enemy nations had conspired to protect a newborn's life. In 1978, Marguerite traveled to the United States for an academic conference and made the journey to Virginia to meet Sarah in person. The reunion was emotional. Two women who'd last seen each other when one was a helpless infant and the other a young nurse, now meeting as mature adults with decades of experience between them. They spent 3 days together, talking about everything and nothing, about the past and the present, about the ways small moments could change entire lives. Marguerite brought photographs, her children, her husband, her students, her mother in later years. Sarah shared her own family photos, her memories of the war and its aftermath, her career in nursing that had been shaped by those months at Camp Ruston. On the final evening of Marguerite's visit, they sat on Sarah's porch, watching the sunset, comfortable in the silence that came with deep understanding. "Do you ever wonder," Marguerite asked, "what would have happened if you'd followed the regulations strictly? If you'd reported my mother and me without advocating for us to stay together?" "Often," Sarah admitted. "I imagine you would have been sent to an institution, probably. Your mother would have been repatriated alone. You might have been reunited eventually, or you might not have been. The chaos after the war made many things uncertain. My mother believed we would have been separated permanently, that I would have been adopted by an American family, perhaps, or placed in an orphanage in Germany. She believed that your intervention was the only thing that kept us together. Maybe. Or maybe the system would have worked correctly eventually. I'd like to think so, anyway." Marguerite shook her head. "I am a historian now, in addition to being a teacher. I have read extensively about the prisoner systems, about the treatment of women and children in the camps, about the repatriation process. The regulations were clear efficiency over individual circumstances, order over compassion. Most of the time, the system did not work correctly. Most of the time, families were separated. Children were lost in bureaucratic tangles. The machinery ground forward without regard for human cost. That's a depressing view of what we were trying to do. It is an honest view, and it makes what you did even more remarkable. You were the exception that proved the rule, the person who chose humanity over efficiency, who fought to protect two people who had no power and no voice. That choice mattered more than you know." They sat in silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Sarah thought about all the choices she'd made in her life, all the patients she'd treated, all the small decisions that had seemed insignificant at the time, but might have changed trajectories she would never know about. And she thought about that November morning in 1945, when she de-examined a young German woman and discovered a secret that demanded action. "I was just doing my job," Sarah said finally, "seeing what was in front of me and responding appropriately." "No," Marguerite replied gently. "You were doing something more than your job. You were being human in a system designed to make people forget their humanity. That is never just a job. That is a choice every single time." The story of Anneliese and Marguerite Becker became more widely known in the 1980s when historians began documenting the experiences of German women prisoners in American camps. Several academic papers referenced the case as an example of how individual military personnel sometimes acted with greater compassion than regulations required, how the prisoner system was flexible enough to allow for humane exceptions when advocates pushed hard enough. But for Sarah and Marguerite, the story was never about historical significance or academic analysis. It was about the moment when a frightened young mother was given the chance to keep her baby, when a nurse chose advocacy over blind rule following, when compassion found space within a military system not designed to accommodate it. Sarah died in 1983, surrounded by family, her life full and well lived. Marguerite attended the funeral, traveling from Germany specifically to pay her respects. She stood at the graveside and thought about the woman who saved her life before she was old enough to understand what life meant, who'd fought for her mother when no one else would, who demonstrated that even in the darkest times, individual choices could create light. "Thank you," Marguerite whispered to the cold ground and the stone marker, "for seeing us, for saving us, for reminding everyone that we were human." The wind carried her words away across the Virginia cemetery, past rows of other graves holding other stories, other lives that had been touched and changed by individual moments of courage or cruelty, compassion or indifference. And somewhere in the vast machinery of history, in the countless small decisions that shape human experience, Marguerite's gratitude joined the chorus of thanks that connects saviors and saved across time and distance and circumstance. Because in the end, that's what the story was about. Not regulations or military systems or prisoner camps or even the war itself. It was about a nurse who saw a woman in need and chose to help. About a mother who loved her child enough to risk everything. About a baby who survived against impossible odds because people chose to fight for her survival. Louisiana, November 1945. A cold examination room, a frightened young mother, a hidden newborn, a nurse making a choice that would echo through decades. The war had created the circumstances, but human decisions, small, individual, courageous decisions created the outcome. And that outcome rippled forward through Marguerite's life and her children's lives and the lives of everyone they touched, proving that even in the midst of systems designed for control and order, there remained space for the most essential human quality of all, the ability to see another person as suffering and choose to help, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the regulations, simply because it was right. That choice, Sarah Mitchell's choice, to advocate rather than simply report, to see Annalise and Marguerite as people deserving protection rather than problems requiring solution, that choice made all the difference. And in a world that often feels shaped by vast impersonal forces, by historical inevitabilities and systemic structures, the story of the hidden baby and the nurse who saved her serves as a reminder that individual actions still matter, that compassion still has power, that one person's courage can change another person's entire life. The sun set over Camp Ruston in November 1945, casting long shadows across the compound. Inside Barracks 7, Annalise held her daughter close, no longer terrified of discovery, no longer forced to hide the most precious thing in her life. Outside, Sarah Mitchell completed her rounds, her medical kit lighter than usual, her heart heavier with the weight of what she'd witnessed and what she'd helped preserve. Neither woman knew how the story would end. Neither could predict the decades that would follow, the lives that would be built, the gratitude that would be expressed across time and distance. They knew only what existed in that moment, a mother and child who would not be separated, a future that remained possible, a small victory for humanity in a world that had tried very hard to crush it. And sometimes that small victory is enough. Sometimes the story of one nurse and one mother and one hidden baby is the story that needs to be told, not because it represents every experience, but because it represents the possibility that lived within every experience. The possibility that even in the worst circumstances, even within systems designed for control rather than compassion, there remained the capacity for human kindness, for individual courage, for the simple act of seeing another person suffering and choosing to help. That possibility, fragile, precious, essential, is what Sarah Mitchell protected when she chose to advocate for Annalise and Marguerite. And that possibility is what Marguerite honored when she grew up to be a woman who taught others about history, about humanity, about the small choices that create large consequences. The story lives on, passed down through families, documented in historical records, serving as a reminder that individual actions matter, that compassion has power, that even the smallest life is worth fighting for. And in a world that often feels dominated by forces beyond individual control, that reminder carries weight beyond its simple narrative. Louisiana, November 1945. A nurse, a mother, a hidden baby, a choice, a consequence, a life saved. And from that moment, ripples extending outward through time, touching lives that would never know the source of their own existence, proving that history is not just made by great leaders and vast armies, but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices in moments that seem small but turn out to be everything.